and my greetings to the group. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all again. If you are in a place where it is safe to do so and you're comfortable, I would ask that you turn your cameras on just so we can see each other. Don't need to keep them on for the duration of the conversation, but nice to be able to connect where possible. So I feel like we're closing in on, I think we're at the halfway point, maybe a little past the halfway point of the fellowship, which is just wild to me. But want to thank everyone for joining today and looking forward to the conversation ahead. As indicated in my email yesterday, I do have a few key announcements that I'd like to take some time to go through. If and when your press release statements are published, please put them in the Slack channel so that we can see. I have a few news alerts set up, but I'm sure they're not as succinct or appropriately tailored to capture everything that's coming out of your individual schools. So as those are rolling out, we really want to see them. It's a great way for us to share information across our network, as well as to see what the different communication plans and approaches are for each individual school. So as we anticipate what the fellowship will be doing going forward in regards to messaging, that information is really helpful. So know that we're looking at it from a few different levels, both what is being communicated as well as how. If I can support you in any way in pushing that forward with various communications officers or public press release folks, do let me know. I don't have any hidden powers in that, but I do have the time to follow up. So if that would be of use, do let me know. As well, please indicate your interest and ability to participate in the Law of the Police conference in South Carolina by completing the form shared previously by end of day today. I'm going to drop that link in the chat for everyone. It's going to be a really exciting event. Professor Stoughton has put on, or is in the process of putting together a great agenda. But as mentioned earlier, I think this would be a great opportunity for you to talk through your experience, what you learned from the research gathered, as well as engage with some leading experts around the law of the police. So depending on what we get from results, we'll be able to determine how best to proceed and how many students we can sponsor in that involvement. I do recognize that the timing is not ideal. Many of you will be involved in bar prep, and I apologize for that. Again, this is an external conference, not one that we had planned, just one that we are jumping on the tailcoats of. And so I will be sure if this is of a valuable opportunity that it's baked into the fellowship going forward. Any questions about that opportunity? Great. I also shared yesterday 2 publication opportunities of potential interest. One is with the ABA, the William Greenlee Student Writing Competition. And I can drop that into the chat for your consideration, as well as one from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, or yeah, their Police Chief Magazine, which is looking at your vision of the future of policing. Again, I am not associated with either of those opportunities, but wanted to present them to you both, to you all for consideration and professional development as your time permits. I recognize time is incredibly scarce, but if those are of interest to you, I wanted to be sure to share. Okay, if you intend to conclude your fellowship before Friday, May 20th and have not already been in touch with me, please do so. We want to make sure we are tracking that information appropriately so we can see how many folks will be in the Zoom room for some of our later sessions. And then on Friday, April 29th at 3 p.m., I've talked about this a few times before, but want to make sure I reiterate it. We'll have an opportunity to be in virtual discussion with Tahir Duckett from the Center for Innovations and Community Safety at Georgetown.
That's it.
That conversation will be moderated by two of our fellows, Jordan and Dawn. Thank you so much for your willingness to moderate that discussion. I'm hoping that by having actual fellows have that dialogue, we're able to see additional value of that program and some of the more immediate lessons learned and how it might be realized both at the student level as well as the faculty level. So that should be fantastic. I have shared that registration link before, but we'll drop it in the chat again shortly. Finally, on Friday, May 13th at 3 p.m., we'll be hosting a virtual discussion with officers from the documentary Ernie and Joe Crisis Cops. In mid-April, that documentary will be made available to the full consortium. So both the fellows, your faculty advisors, your law library directors, your deans, so that you can view the documentary in anticipation for the May 13th meeting date. I do not yet have a registration link for it, but just want to share that date as one to put on your calendar. In anticipation for that, I am also looking for two fellows to support in the facilitation of that conversation with the officers involved. This documentary focuses a lot on the need for mental health training for officers for their own support throughout their careers, as well as engagement with the community. I know the mental health component of policing was of interest to a number of you. So if you are interested in that theme and available on May 13th at 3 p.m., please let me know and I can coordinate with you to bring you into that conversation. I have a final assignment that I will be rolling out to the group. I recognize reporting requirements vary across the consortium. However, it is imperative that we have some sort of summary memo based off of all of the research that you have gathered. So I have that guidance drafted and we'll be sharing it with the group ideally early next week once it is signed off by the appropriate personnel who with that authority. That's a fair bit of information. So I'm going to take a pause and ask if there are any questions or concerns about what has just been flagged.
Hi, this is Catrice. Really quickly, how long does the memo need to be, the summary memo?
So Catrice, I'm going to need to work with each individual on that because of the different reporting requirements. A broad overview of what I am looking for, though, is a summary of your findings. What was easily accessible, what was not, who are the key stakeholders involved in the conversation in your community. And I don't mean to wholly put you on the spot, but I think particularly, Catrice, based off of your positioning in Cleveland, your memo is going to be really influential. I'm hoping that this can be an opportunity for you to talk about what you learned and provide personalized recommendations, kind of an editorial of if you had ultimate control over the entirety of the criminal legal system in your community, what you would want to do and who would need to be engaged, including your law school.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, couldn't locate the unmute button. So for the Wayne Law students, I know we have to submit a 20 or 25 page report. Do you mind if we share that with you in regards to our finding? And I think we're submitting that towards the end near finals. Is that okay if we share that with you?
That would be fantastic. Yes, thank you.
Perfect. And that's in lieu of the memo.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. Great. I'm very much a learner who takes in information by reading it first. So what I will do is, again, early next week, share the instructions regarding the final assignment memo to the group. And again, we'll have office hours on Wednesday when we can talk about it in a bit more detail. But that will be shared before there is an expectation. But again, recognizing some students are cycling off towards the end of April, want to make that available sooner rather than later. Great. This is a completely unrelated to the theme of our conversation, but Catherine, your dog is beautiful, and I'm delighted that they're able to join this conversation today. Okay, now I am so honored and really excited to hand the floor to a speaker who I've known for some time, and every conversation we have just fills me both with interest and excitement around their area of expertise. So today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Tamara Herold from the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. Tamara is not a legal scholar. She comes at things from a criminology perspective and has just such an impressive resume as well as passion in this space, and is joining us today to talk about something obviously central to the conversation of the consortium, looking at policing protests and some of the crowd psychology associated with that, as well as how police have been trained to police protests in the past and what good practice might look like going forward. So, Tamara, thank you again so much for being here on a Friday afternoon.
No,
I hand the virtual floor to you.
thank you so much. And it is an honor and a privilege. And I was almost all of you. I had a very difficult decision between law school and graduate school. And if I could, I would love, if we had the time, to know how you ended up doing what you're doing right now, because our paths are just absolutely crazy. As I talk to people in life circumstances and what brings people to do the things that they do, it's just incredible. I don't know, Jessalyn, if you know this, but I was once upon a time, I didn't wear glasses, and I was a rock guitarist. I was studying music. I was a classical guitarist in college, and that was my path. And, I was taking an elective. I took a criminal justice elective, and the instructor for that class happened to be one of the very first females ever hired by the LA County Sheriff's Department in California. And she blew my mind. She had the craziest stories I had ever heard in my life. She told me that basically when they came on, they gave her a skirt, heels, a handgun for her a handbag for her 2-inch gun. And they said, let's see if ladies can be cops. And anyway, so here I am in my leather jacket, my torn jeans, right? It was, the 90s. And I'm like, what is she talking about? And I could not grasp like her life experience. And as part of her class, she said, you have to do a ride along. And I thought, okay. And I had a family friend who worked in, if you guys are familiar at all with California, Southgate, which is just outside of Compton. I'm 18 years old. They had to make sure I could work the shotgun before I could take the ride on the ride along, because it was so violent. I watched this officer, who was a family friend, pull his weapon 7 times in one evening. Some officers never pull their weapon in the course of their career, pull their weapon 7 times. And I'm in the midst of everything. I'm such a, I'm this young, naive, like crazy person. And I'm riding around going, I can't believe that this happens, and that there are communities that suffer from this type of violence. And I'm trying to take this all in. And he turns to me and he says, women really have no place in policing. And I just about lost my mind, because here I was, right, a longtime family friend. And I thought, that's it. And I gave up my guitar. It's still on my wall behind me. And if I had more time, I'd bust it out for you guys. We could sing along or do something. But I gave up my guitar. I said, I'm going to dedicate my life to this. And I never meant to go the academic route. I really meant to go into the field. I thought that's where I would. But you know how it is when you are really good academically. Obviously, you all do. So you start getting all these opportunities, and people encourage you, and you get scholarships. And so they were trying to, should I go to law school? Should I go to graduate school? And I just happened to stumble across an individual who did a lot of policing research. His name's John Eck. He developed the problem-solving model for police, and he's one of the most amazing human beings in the world. I met him. If you ever meet him, he's got the craziest laugh. Don't tell him he knows. And definitely tell him I said that. He was my mentor, and I ended up going the PhD route. I went to the University of Cincinnati, and it totally changed my life. And so I've spent the last couple of decades really working to improve the profession, right? I kind of went in with this chip on my shoulder thinking there's no place for women, right? And I was so angry about that. But in the course of all of this, I have just spent an amazing amount of time in the field with people, trying to figure out how to improve what it is that we do. And so I'm so passionate about this thing. And so when Jessalyn, I actually said, what do you want me to talk about? And we came up with like a list, and she said, I think the protest angle will be the best. And so I was trying to imagine, okay, when I was deciding between law school, graduate school, what would have really been helpful for me to know if I could take my brain and dissect it now and just give it to you. And what I think is really helpful might be some frameworks that you can use to evaluate if we're moving in the right direction, because there are a lot of well-intentioned efforts to improve things that either do nothing or they backfire. And I'll give you some examples of those. And so really what I have for you is sort of like a couple of criteria that as you're hearing about proposed legislation, as you're hearing about changes that people want to make to policing, you can kind of judge it against these criteria to say, is this actually going to make a significant impact? And I can't give you the methodology behind where all this came from, but if you ever want to hang out, I'll give you my contact information at the end of this. We can have more in-depth conversations. And if it's okay with you, Jessalyn, I'll share my screen. That works. Okay. Here we go. All right, cool. So it's really interesting to me. My professional background, I went to study with John Eck at the University of Cincinnati. I sort of concentrated my efforts in my training in an area known as crime science. It's also referred to as environmental criminology. And I kind of became the guru, the go-to person for something called place management. So the way that we design and manage places and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the crime triangle, I focus on that aspect of place and what we can do. What was so interesting was the Department of Justice went to John and they said, would you help translate research into practice to help improve policing? And they were looking at student party riots at the time, which is really fascinating. And the things that I was able to explore as part of that. So initially, one of the very first policing guides I'd produced was on student party riots. That was such a success. They said, well, you do one on spectator violence in stadiums. And I'm like, heck yeah. So I'm touring all the stadiums across the United States. I'm involved with all the major sports leagues. I'm like, this is like the coolest gig in the world. Like I had no idea that this would lead to this, but then obviously starting to understand the dynamics of crowds, I realized there is so little research in this area to help people understand crowds, crowd dynamics, what to do about it. So myself and Johannes Knudsen, who works primarily in Sweden and Norway, we produced an international volume on preventing crowd violence that focused a lot on all different types of crowds, but including protest-related crowds. So that's kind of my foyer into this. And now, obviously, I'm in Las Vegas. And for those of you who need a site visit, again, give me a call. It is when I moved to Ohio, the only person who visited me was my mother, bless her. When I moved to Vegas, now everybody wants to come and see me. So please feel free to reach out if you want to come hang out in Las Vegas. But one of the best things about Las Vegas for me, it is a perfect laboratory to study all different types of crowds and crowd dynamics, everything from protests to sporting events to major conventions. It really is a phenomenal place. And so, like I said, what I thought, if I could just give you these frameworks and these criteria, and then I really would love to have a conversation about these and how you see how these might be helpful or where there might be gaps for you. And as you're trying to assess what might work to improve policing moving forward. But the first thing I'll talk about is what I've learned about when we try to engage in reform, how we fail. Then I'll talk with you about an actual model that you can use when you're trying to figure out what can we do to improve the way in which police are interacting with protesters and how we can improve safety and guarantee constitutional rights. I'll give you this model and you'll see how it ties into what I would consider to be an effective reform model. But I can tell you, as all of you I know are very well aware, there's a massive call for police reform right now. I mean, for me, this is actually so exciting because I've spent the last 2 decades trying to push for change. And now we have it, right? The floor is ours. And we're like, what do we want? What do we want this to look like? And for those of you who are following this area, the laundry list of proposed reforms is long, right? And it's just, I mean, it's all over the place, all sorts of things that we want to do that we think might improve policing. What's really interesting about all of this reform that has taken place, and there's been tons of it across the country, the systemic problems that are contributing to the very injustices that we want to prevent from happening they're still occurring, right? So I just read about the Mr. Henderson in Trenton, New Jersey, who was shot and killed, right? These shootings and a lot of these interactions that we're hoping these reforms will address, for some reason, we're missing the mark. And I think we're missing the mark for a couple of reasons. And I'll give you the three things that I would say you should really, when you're thinking about change in this profession, three things that we should try to avoid. And then you'll see how this crowd management model fits into this so very well. Part of the reason I would say that list is not as effective as we would think, just especially if you're an outsider and you're not in the profession, you go, of course, these things will help. A lot of these proposed reforms were adopted decades ago by major police departments, right? There's some departments that are kind of out of policy, and that's because we don't have national standards. And that's something I am working so hard with people like Jesslyn to change. So, we're engaged in all of that. But for the most part, it's a lot of old wine in a new bottle. And people, now we say we need de-escalation. In the 80s, we called it verbal judo, right? There was some other name for it. Now we call it something else. So please know in the back of your mind, a lot of what's being proposed is not new. So that's part of the reason I think some of this has not been as effective as we want. Another big reason for me, from my perspective, obviously, as the academic that went the graduate route, when I think about why some of these reforms are not having the intended effect, is that a lot of this is because we are so driven by emotion. I am a justice seeker. I see an injustice and I want action and I want it now. And I want change. Unfortunately for us, a lot of our change is not grounded in empirical evidence or science. It's just not. So I did this massive literature review, and you guys do a lot of writing, so you can appreciate the pain and the struggle. And I did a massive, basically meta-analysis of all of the research from every discipline, not just criminal justice, on de-escalation. So not the crisis intervention, mental health kind of intervention stuff, but on de-escalation, some of the proposed reform. And it was fascinating. I gave this presentation, actually, Jesslyn, to George Mason University a few years ago. I'm standing in front of a room full, half police chiefs or executives, half academics. And my punchline at the end of this 20-minute presentation where I'm showing them all this is that we had no rigorous empirical evidence to suggest that the de-escalation training that we were spending millions of dollars on had any impact at all. They went nuts. You guys would have appreciated it. I wish I could put you in the room with me right then, right there. You should have seen these chiefs were like standing up. I almost caused a riot. It was total crowd psychology. They went insane. They said, "Doctor, are you telling me I've just spent, $3 million to train my officers? We don't know if it works?" And I had to go, precisely, we don't know. That's a problem. So, for example, a lot of people are talking about implicit bias training, right? And that is a huge push. And in fact, some states are legislating we should have implicit bias training. And you hear that and you go, of course we should have implicit bias training, right? Of course it would be useful. Well, we did a randomized controlled trial in New York City. People that are associated with my research team on New York City police officers. And what we found following the implementation of this implicit bias training, arrests across the board went down, but racial disparities increased dramatically. So if we were interested in reducing racial disparities, whatever we were doing with that training was having an unintended effect. That is so important for us to know before we go demanding changes, right? We need to have it grounded in evidence and science. And so one of the things that I always say is that the field can't wait for academics. We are so slow. By the time we write the grant proposal, we do the research, we turn around, it's a mess. But one thing I would say is demand. If you are going to implement some sort of new intervention, especially if it's costly, demand that there is some sort of evaluation associated with that, so that if there are unintended consequences, we can address those. And we just haven't gotten there as a profession yet. So that's the first kind of avoid that, like avoid the knee jerk. Let's think about this and what we need in terms of empirical evidence to move forward. The other thing that I see happening that I really worry about is that we are attempting, in order to stop the problems that are systemic in policing and associated with policing, instead of addressing those issues, we are trying to remove police from the equation. Now, I'm open to this. I have a very open mind about this, but let me share with you why I think that might not be the right way to go when we're dealing with problems associated with policing. So Egon Bittner, if you study police history, he said basically the role of the police is to be on hand when something that ought not be happening and about which somebody better do something now is basically happening. So when I'm in a car and I hear a call for service, in my mind, in my critical mind, when I'm thinking about what's happened, I say some system has failed. It could be education. It could be our healthcare system. It could be our parenting system, right? It could be, just think of all the educational systems. Some system has failed and now there's some sort of harm happening in society, right? Now we're asking the police to show up and somehow address this. And so in the past, there's been this really strange conversation to me, and you guys probably have heard this. Do we want guardians or do we want warriors? And they'll say, we don't want police to have a warrior mindset. We want them to have a guardian mindset, which is a very different mindset, they'll say. I think it's a false dichotomy, and I'll tell you why. So 3 blocks from my home, a year ago yesterday, was the King Super shooting in Boulder, Colorado. So I have a home in Boulder, Colorado. And in that shooting, 10 innocent victims were gunned down, including a police officer, right? Now, when the police ran in, right, to stop that shooting, the police officer, once that police officer was killed, no other civilians were killed, and they were able to capture the suspect. And obviously, police were acting as warriors in that sense, right? They were willing to die in the line of duty to save innocent lives. I don't think it's a guardian or warrior mindset that we're after. What we should be after is that police are acting as ambassadors. When they see injustice, when they see harm, when they see vulnerable people being victimized, that they act as their advocates and as their ambassadors. And it's very hard to do that if you're removing police from the day-to-day harms of the community and saying, we only want you to show up when there's a critical incident. Well, then guess what? Now we have the warriors. I don't want warriors. I want exactly what Robert Peel proposed very early on. What the ideal for policing would be is that the police are the community and the community are the police. They are the fabric of the community. They should be serving as ambassadors. So one of the projects I won't talk about today that Jessalyn and I talked about is a huge violence reduction initiative that I've been a part of, where we redefine the role of police, and they go into these communities and they advocate for city resources for people in their communities, in their most vulnerable, disadvantaged communities. I cannot tell you the community response, the reductions in violence, how amazing that has been to me. So I want evidence. I want police to act as ambassadors. And the other thing that I find so frustrating, and you guys will so appreciate this, I think, as law school students, is most of the reform that's proposed is it's non-aspirational. That's my term for it. You guys, if you have a better one, call me. I'll share in the wealth of it. I need a great term for this, but it's very non-aspirational in the sense, when I say non-aspirational, what I mean by that is that we're only talking about what we don't want police to do. We never talk about what we do want them to do in a lot of this legislation. What we basically say is we don't want police to, and then think of that long laundry list of reforms. We don't want police to use this type of weapon. We don't want police to engage in this type of tactic. That's okay. I think that it is much less effective than thinking about what we do want, being aspirational about this, rather than legislating to the lowest common denominator. Let's think about what we want to be. So it's kind of like if I have a child and I go, I'm just legislating to the lowest common denominator. Dear Lord, please do not let my child grow up to be a serial killer. Please don't let that happen. I'm going to do everything to stop them from being a serial killer. I'd be the worst thing to happen to me as a parent. My child was, and that's what my focus is, versus please let me be able to raise a wonderful, healthy, productive human being, and thinking about the things I need to do to create that outcome. So I think about when I went to graduate school, my initial mindset was not good because I really didn't have a lot of confidence. I remember thinking, please just don't let me fail out of graduate school, right? I was like, please, dear God, please don't let that happen. But as I got into graduate school and I gained the confidence, I realized, oh, I started thinking about what I did want out of graduate school. oh my God, I want to be number one in my cohort. I want to develop my networks. I want to change the world. I want to impact my field. That is a very different mindset than if you're just thinking about what you don't want to have happen. The problem with legislation right now is it's being proposed by very well-intentioned people who know nothing about the profession. They have a hard time being aspirational about it. And if we were being aspirational about it, I heard Jesslyn say many of you are interested in mental health and policing, a variety of things. We'd be thinking about those issues. So thank you if you're one of those individuals thinking about those types of issues. And so in the end, when I'm saying the path forward, I'd say, resist these things, but now I'm falling into my own trap. I'm not being very aspirational. I'm saying don't do these things, but then what should we do? I would say we should, as a group of people who really want social justice, want change, want to improve this, we need to collectively and urgently call for access to evidence-based training for these officers. They rarely get it. Most police do not know their own profession. They do not know crime science. That's a huge problem. Jesslyn worked with us on a project related to this. We need to clearly define what we want police to be, and we need to adopt those aspirational models. So let me give you one. Here's one for you as you are thinking about protests and policing. So this RDFC interaction model came out of a lot of this interdisciplinary research, psychology, sociology, public health models, criminology, trying to think through when do things go right and when do things go wrong as it pertains to policing crowds. So the model itself has 4 components, and you can kind of think of them as an order of operation, and you can think of them independently, but I can tell you the degree to which we can promote policy, training, and tactics that are aligned with these 4 dimensions, we are much more likely to have the type of policing that we would want to see, the most successful type of policing we'd want to see. We talk about police interacting with protests. So I'll talk about each one briefly, and we can have a much more in-depth conversation. I swear I could talk to you guys for like 10 hours on each of these dimensions, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, whet your appetite, and then we can talk about what you find most interesting. But the first dimension is all about reasonableness. And so one of the things that I do when I go in, I do a lot of training for law enforcement and for police. I hate the term law enforcement because it assumes that's all that police do. But when I go in and I'm training police, whether I was so privileged to be asked to train US Secret Service and US Pentagon police not long ago, which was so cool to be at that federal level. And I thought it was so cool that they're thinking about this. They wanted to be so aspirational. But one of the things that we talk a lot about, we spend a lot of time talking about, is we're not just law enforcement officials. That's not it. Of course, we can enforce the laws. The laws are on the books. We'll be justified in enforcing the laws. But sometimes just because you're justified doesn't mean it's right. So to be reasonable, we really have to think about an approach in which we are asking people to do only what is necessary to protect, right? That's it. We're not doing it just to do it. And I'll give you some great examples. So this was I could not believe that this happened. And some of you might have seen this. This was a few years back. This was on the UC Davis campus, but there was a peaceful protest and there were students who had sat down along a walkway and had linked arms. I don't know if anybody remembers this. They were just sitting there linking arms. And at some point they declared this an unlawful assembly, and a lieutenant comes along and he pepper sprays them in the face in an attempt to get them to move. I don't know of anybody who could look at this and say, this is a reasonable approach to what was going on, the dynamics of what was going on at that moment. I don't think anybody's life was in danger. I don't think anybody's property was being destroyed. I don't think anybody was more vulnerable because these students were sitting on this particular. Now, technically, legally, this officer was justified in doing this because it was declared an unlawful assembly. There's no justification for this, right? This is the reasonableness part of this. Now, here's Las Vegas. You guys can tell it's Las Vegas. How? If you can spot the street performer, I think it's Woody from Toy Story in there, so you know it's Las Vegas. He's part of the protest. This is how we do it in Las Vegas. We just do crazy things. So this was part of the Occupy protests. And what was so fascinating is often, with these protests, they're marching up and down the strip, and some of the protest starts to creep into the street. Now, at that point, the police could try to push people back onto the sidewalk, right? And say, there's a safety issue here, lots going on. Instead, they call out their motor unit and they block off that lane of traffic and they ensure the safe facilitation of people marching down the street. That's a reasonable approach to protecting life and protecting safety. Are we blocking a lane of traffic? Yes. Is traffic on the strip terrible? Yes. Is it going to inconvenience a few people? Yes. But in the name of constitutional freedoms, we need to restrict the fewest freedoms possible in order to achieve our objectives. That's the first step. But let's say that we have to restrict freedoms, because we sometimes do. Right? Sometimes we have to ask people not to do something in the name of safety and security, right? When that happens, we have to rely on the second dimension of the model, which is to be disarming. We need to limit our use of force, coercion, and intrusiveness as much as possible. This was a photo that came out in the media of Baltimore police officers. And I looked at this and I said, what is going on? So protesters threw a rock, were throwing rocks at these officers. And at one point, that officer that you see pictured there picked up one of the rocks and threw it back. I've had a lot of conversations with people who are very much in alignment with my thinking and thinking about protests and protecting freedoms, but maintaining safety. And this guy, this practitioner, I think the world of him, he had the best line for me. And it helped me to start thinking about things a little bit differently. He told me, my officers tend to make bad decisions when they feel like they're out of options, right? Now, as an academic, I thought a lot about this and I thought, how do I make officers feel like they have more options? What is it that I have to do in trainings to make officers understand that that's not an appropriate option? What are better options? And so as Jessalyn talked about, I'm so into the crowd psychology stuff. I absolutely love it. It is so cool. I use it every day on everyone I love. It works so well. They hate me for it. But I'm telling you right now, there is so much to be learned about knowing how to relate to humans. It's more than de-escalation. It's so much more than that. So what I spend a lot of time doing is teaching these psychological principles, some of these theories to these officers, and then working through case studies. One of my favorites has one of the most terrible names. It's elaborated social identity models. So, an academic came up with that. We call it ESOM for short, right? But and the takeaway, like the cutaway, is basically the more aggressive you are, the more aggressive the crowd is going to become, or this could be any interaction at any level. But you know what's so interesting? If you guys study police use of force models, it looks like a stair, most of them, like a stepstone. Suspect escalates, now police can escalate. Suspect escalates again, now police can escalate again. When does it come? Where does it come back down? It doesn't in those traditional models. We need a completely different model, completely different way of looking at this. And I have seen this firsthand, how a relatively peaceful crowd, because of the actions, the inappropriate actions of a couple of officers, to maybe it was an incident, something happened in the crowd, people perceive this injustice. What happens in this psychological model, everybody starts to form a shared identity and they now fight against what they see as this perceived injustice. So we talk about how important the perception is. So when someone sees a tank rolling into their community, that perception alone, I mean, dear God, right? What that's going to set off, the psychological processes that this sets off in people. And I have a lot of really cool, funny stories that, just how police were able to turn things around, again, because I'm aspirational, by understanding crowd psychology, right? And so I had this one individual who's a friend of mine who at UNLV was sent to go chase a field invader. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Like the person that runs on the field who's drunk and out of their minds and it's super fun and they're running through the field. And this poor guy gets sent, you got to go get this police officer. So the officer runs, tackles is a drunk woman, kind of small in stature. And when he hit her a little bit too hard, right? It just, the perception was bad. And he said, at that moment, I could hear the whole stadium go, right? He had lost that crowd. That crowd was going to turn on that officer in a minute. He grabs the woman, he stands her up, he dusts her off and he grabs her arm and he thrusts it into the air. And the whole crowd cheers. Now, this is important because, it's sort of a silly story and a fun story, but it's a story that illustrates how much control police really have over the outcomes of some of these interactions based on how they engage with the crowd, what they know about crowd psychology. My second favorite theory is reactance theory. I actually heard a child psychologist on NPR talk a little bit about this. And if any of you have children or younger siblings, or you can remember what it's like to be a child, what this person said was brilliant. They said, if you need your child to stop playing, put on their shoes and get in the car, the last thing you want to do is tell them, stop playing, put on your shoes and get in the car, right? Because we naturally as human beings do not like that. We don't want to be told what to do, even little kids, and some are more oppositional than others. And what the child psychologist had talked about was being able to say, walk up to a child with 2 pairs of shoes and say, which shoes do you want to wear today? Changes the trajectory of that conversation and what happens. And that's really about being really clever about and thinking through what our intentions are and how we really want to treat people and interact with people. And there's so many great examples that I can give you about this. And if it comes up in our discussion, I'll give you some more. But just having these theories and understanding them in their back pocket increases their options so they can be disarming, right? And so when I think about this, try not to restrict freedoms, but when we have to do it in a way that's very disarming so people feel respected, people feel like their voice is heard, people feel like, we're talking one-on-one as human beings. But every once in a while that doesn't work. And there are people who commit harm in society. They harm other individuals or they destroy property. And when that happens, and police do have to intervene and maybe even use force, it has to be highly focused. Here's where we run into trouble, is when we indiscriminately, right, apply force to an entire crowd or an entire group of people. And what happens when that happens is that, so here's an example, the police had used gas to disperse an unlawful assembly, right? They'd all declared an unlawful assembly. What do we see? We see the person in the wheelchair that had trouble getting out of that area by themselves. So people had to run back into the gas to help that woman come back out. That is not the perception, right? That is not what you want people to see. Here you see, this is a homeless man. This was in LA. This was a protest. Police had fired indiscriminately less lethal weapons into a crowd. Here you can see this individual gets hit in the eye, in the face with one of these projectiles. They're called less lethal. They're not non-lethal. They're less lethal. So there's a huge risk in just using indiscriminate force against an entire group of people. So that is something that has to be part of our training, to know to be so focused and be so, when we are intervening, thinking very strategically about how and when we're intervening and how and when we use force, we do that. And then the final component of this is consistency. So again, to think, how reasonable, how disarming, how focused, and how consistent is this officer, was this strategy? You could use it on any level, but consistency matters a lot. And I draw from a guy named Colvin who comes up with coercion theory. He's brilliant. And he basically says the outcome of any effort to control human behavior is influenced by these 2 dimensions: the degree to which we're coercive and the degree to which we're erratic or consistent. The worst thing we can ever be is erratic and coercive, right? Those are the 2 things we have to avoid at all costs. Why? Unpredictability diminishes trust. If I don't know what's going to happen next, and I can tell you, over the course of the protests over this past year, one of the things that contributed to a lot of inconsistency was that policing became political. Politicians got involved and changed the rules from day to day about when police could intervene, what police could do. Again, well-intentioned individuals trying to do this, creating all sorts of inconsistency in how the police approached protests. And this was a massive problem. So all 4 of these dimensions matter. And this is why, right? If we want people to perceive this as lawful and necessary to prevent harm, we're not using avoidable coercion or intrusiveness. We're only intervening when there's some sort of threat, and we're really targeting the behaviors and the individuals that are creating those threats. And we are dependable, right? We're unbiased. We are as consistent as we can possibly be. These are the dimensions upon which I think, as we align ourselves with policy training and tactics, the better we can do this. And one of the best ways that we can do this is to be explicit about what we want. Going back to that, our primary goal is to protect freedoms. That's what policing in a democratic society does. It protects our constitutional freedoms. That's it. That's what they are there to do. When they do have to intervene, they have to do so in a way that's disarming, that will de-escalate, not go up that chain of escalation. We need to ensure safety. That's the primary goal of a government, is to ensure the safety of its citizens, and we need to be establishing confidence. And those are the 4 things that really, really matter. So I was so humbled. I'll leave it with this. So the state of Ohio called me back up. I can't get away from them, guys. I went there for grad school, and now they keep calling me. But they wanted to come up with guidelines. So again, trying to set standards. So of course I threw myself. I'm like, pro bono work all day long. What do you need? What's going on? They said, we want to establish guidelines for how police agencies should respond to mass protests and demonstrations. And it was good. And they had some really key things that were, basically, here's the list of usual suspects. We've got legal standards, we've got procedures, we've got mutual aid agreements, we've got mass arrest standards, so on and so forth. But the thing I was most proud of, because all of these things address the 4 basic types of risk mitigation. We either accept risk, we try to avoid it, we try to transfer it, we try to reduce it. One of the things that they quoted was the last aspirational thing. It's in the guidelines, and they've even cited me. I can't believe they cited me. And I was like, oh, that's even better. But they cited me and said, we need to think beyond risk. We need to think about who we want police to be, right? We need to think about the outcomes that we want. And they actually have that in their guidelines for the documents, which gave me so much hope, because usually we're just thinking about how not to let the next tragedy happen. Of course, we don't want the next tragedy to happen. But I think one of the best ways to avoid that tragedy is to align ourselves with these aspirational goals. And I think that that's a critical component of what we're missing right now. So I think I did it, Justin. I think I kept it to about 35 minutes there. But this is my contact information. If you call my office, it rings my cell, so I have no qualms with putting my cell on there either. I'm usually somewhere else in the world, Jesslyn knows this, rather than in my office. So if any of you ever want to chat about this, if you need resources, if you need information about this, I'm an open book, and I'd love to help. So Justin, I'm gonna turn this back over to you, and thank you all so much for your time.
That was, I've got to watch my language since we're recording. Awesome. Thank you. I want to hand the floor. I've been watching the chat, and Catrice raises a really interesting question, particularly since she is based in Ohio. And so Catrice, I wonder if I could ask you to come off mute to ask your question.
Yes, so as you know, I'm in the Buckeye State, and we tend to do things big, go hard or go home.
Right.
Literally, you want to go home. Because I think it's now, first it was Ohio, then it was Indiana, obviously getting rid of the gun permits, and getting rid of the requirement to have training before carrying a firearm. They're taking it to another extreme, and you also know that we're a stand your law state. Yeah. Now this new extreme is that municipalities, so trumping home rule, that municipalities cannot close gun stores, and they cannot disarm lawful gun carriers during rioting. And so we all can presume that when they say rioting, that's usually lawful protest, probably predominantly by people of color, right? And as we saw, particularly in May of 2020. So that causes me great concern, because we have seen protests that start off peacefully, and then you have a few instigators who will cause property damage or throw bricks at police, and in an attempt to get the police to escalate the situation. But you also have these quote unquote lawful gun carriers, right? Usually of a different political spectrum, also showing up to these protests armed. Yes. We may not necessarily have that threat in Cleveland, but it is possible to have that threat in Columbus or Cincinnati or even Dayton. Oh, yeah. So I'm wondering, what perspective can you provide, with this potential new dynamic being added to protests?
I saw this and I was sort of beside myself. So we're an open carry state in Nevada, and it freaks me out because there are people walking down the strip with guns like visible. And regardless of your political leanings on this, I understand the Second Amendment. And I've had wonderful conversations with people who are such staunch advocates for the Second Amendment. I don't own a gun, but that I take all the politics out of it. Let's just focus on harm, safety of a community. And again, I think your question is so great because it lends itself to exactly what I get angry with these legislators for doing. Why are they legislating this? Let's ask ourselves that, first of all. Second of all, let's think about, is this aspirational in any way that's going to promote community reductions in community harm or safety? It's really not. This is where I was saying when politics gets into policing, we create all sorts of dynamics that can be really harmful. I see this as one, and it's a personal, please do not link this to my larger institution or anything else. It's a personal belief. When I saw that, I was really taken aback because, and I will tell you what, big city chiefs don't agree with this, who see gun violence on a regular basis in Ohio, do not agree with this. Chief Elliot Isaac, I'm sure, right, who I've worked with in the past on all sorts of problem-solving issues down in Cincinnati, would not agree with this. People who understand the dynamics of gun violence cannot imagine that this would lead to positive outcomes. But what we have a really hard time doing, and you touched on this, is because we're so divided, our ideologies are so divided, we have such a hard time coming together and just having basic conversations. Imagine though, if we use those two frameworks that I just talked about today as the ground rules, and we said, okay, let's problem solve this. What could Catrice, we'd have totally different outcomes. And I was part of the Columbus, when they did the after action response to the protests in Columbus, they had me on that task force with Ohio State. Wow, right? There's so much, I'm so glad you're in Ohio. There's so much work to be done in Ohio. But you know, what I would say is don't be fooled by this kind of nonsense because, and it's unfortunate, it's going to take a tragedy for this to be reversed. But make no mistake, I believe that that's coming. So I think the ground rules, we don't have good ground rules, and this is why this is getting passed. So I'm sorry. I feel for you.
Thank you.
If I can help you in some way, I'll be some muscle for you. Let me know if you're ever in these conversations and I can do something for you.
Other questions or comments from that? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. Really appreciate having you. It was very informative. In regards to your research that you did, I think it was eye-opening. The route that I'm taking is more redefining the roles of police, starting with dispatchers. So rather than just sending police officers to instead send like negotiation peace officers or social workers to certain situations that actually don't need an officer that's going to use force. In that regards, do you recommend some research or survey questionnaire type done with dispatchers on, in these circumstances or scenarios, who would you dispatch to the area? Because dispatchers have, I think, 2 years experience, at least in Dearborn, rather than police officers, they go to a police academy for like 6 months.
Yes.
So they're well equipped to actually redirect these calls to the accurate sites rather than just sending an officer on site.
Sure. So I'll say two things. And please, if you'll email me, I'll send you the study I'm about to reference. But one thing is I believe strongly in co-response models. Obviously, once a call comes in 911, that there's an emergency, this is what I was saying. I really worry about taking police completely out of the equation. That doesn't mean that the police are best situated to maybe respond to those, and they might need other people with other expertise to come in and do something. Unfortunately, I've not yet seen a model that's had great outcomes, even with the co-response. I've seen some, but the evidence is limited. I don't think it's because we should give up on that. I think we just need to rethink how we're doing it. So I want to be very thoughtful about some of these models. I don't like the models where we're sending some other agency entirely, and I'll tell you why. There's no other 24/7 agency boots on the ground. I can't find it anywhere. I cannot find, in most jurisdictions where they're trying to hire social workers and other, they can't get them to work from 2 a.m. to, you know, whatever, right? It's so hard. Police are naturally situated to kind of be that first line of defense. But I do think those co-response models have so much promise. I just haven't seen a lot of empirical evidence to support it yet, but don't give up on it. Second, Cynthia Lum and colleagues, she's out of George Mason. She just did this phenomenal study on calls for service coming in. Now, it's not on the dispatchers themselves. Your question's a really good one. What types of training, education do dispatchers need to appropriately? And there's one of the most overlooked aspects of the system. So thank you for your time and attention on that particular agent in our system. I think it's so important. But she did, and she looks at the proportion of calls that could potentially be assigned to some other organization, agency, somebody else. And I think you'll find it really at least like a first step into, okay, now let's focus on this subset. What should we be doing with that? And how do we train dispatchers to recognize those calls? I think is what you're getting at. So first identifying what those calls might be, and then identifying how do we get dispatchers. And again, I'm going to say it's going to be some framework with criteria, right? Where they basically said, okay, this call meets these 3 criteria. This is going to trigger a different response on my behalf. And so check out that study. If you can't find it right away, just send me an email and I'll get you a copy, no problem.
Sorry, thank you so much. That was great. What was her name? Sorry, Cynthia?
Cynthia Lum, LUM, and she's awesome. She's one of my favorite academics in the field, LUM. She just has the most amazing work.
Thank you so much. And just to follow up, so my, I guess, recommendation or what I was thinking is more in regards to having the different individuals rather than a completely separate agency to be a part of the police agency, which is going to use police funding, not eliminating police completely, but either bringing that agency in or allowing for that agency, for the police officers to be trained in that field, because I don't think there's accurate training, whether it's domestic violence or social work or any of that sort. So that's some avenue that I'm trying to research.
You are so dead on. And I'll tell you what, it's almost criminal, the amount of training some officers receive. I would think it's ridiculous. There is a lethality assessment that has been empirically shown, and I'm sure with the domestic violence, shown to reduce homicides, domestic homicides, when police officers apply that on the scene. And do you know most departments don't use that? All the lives we could save, all the things we could be doing. But again, because our evidence isn't getting infused into the field, we are failing these officers. They don't have the training. They don't have the evidence. And so thank you for the work you're doing. It's inspiring. That's very cool.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thanks.
Hi, sorry, this is Catrice. I just wanted to say that I do have research showing that a care responder model is effective in 24 hours. There's at least 4 entities that I have.
So please send it to me so I can start promoting that stuff. That's amazing.
Right. I just have to check in my folder what's confidential and what isn't.
I know what you mean. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yep. But I'm happy to share that. And we also have dispatcher training out of our Adams board for Cuyahoga County, and both for the co-responder model and care. So I'll sift through my files to see what I can share and what I can't, and then I'll forward.
And this is what I was talking about, like it takes forever for research to catch up to what we need right now. And so that's a great example of that. So whatever you can share, please give me a call and reach out. Maybe Jessalyn can share with the group, whatever can be shared would be awesome.
Okay.
Happy to, and recognizing we're a little short on time, but Karen, you've had your hand up and I want to give the floor to you.
I just wanted to chime in on the discussion on the dispatchers. I know here in Austin, I was doing some work with their police oversight office, and they were trying to reroute funding, and they are implementing a co-model themselves. One thing they did with the dispatchers is they actually did hire social workers to work with the dispatchers who, so they can actually be right there when there's a question of, can this call be routed somewhere else? Or, there's just that second layer before it gets, assigned. So that's something to watch. I know they literally just implemented that, so they're still figuring it out. But so obviously there's some departments that are going in that direction.
That's awesome. And a good friend of mine, Anne, is now working with the academy over there. So it's very cool that you're part of that police oversight. That's the new, I think, gap. We don't have a lot of academic programs that help prepare people to be part of those oversight boards or to help lead those monitorships. So I'm really excited as this becomes more common for us to try to fill that gap too. So that's so exciting. That work is really cool.
we are at 4 o'clock on the dot Eastern time. And
Nice job.
that, that was a heck of an information marathon. But any other concluding thoughts or questions before we wrap up?
Let me stop sharing this. I should have done that before. I do apologize.
Grant?
And thanks to all of you who could turn on your cameras. And hopefully someday, I do appreciate this virtual world because I get to meet people I wouldn't normally meet, but promise me if you're in Vegas or Boulder, you give me a call and let me know you're in town, and we'll grab some coffee and we'll talk about these really, really important issues. And again, I'm honored. Thank you, Jessalyn, for the invitation. And thank you for the work that you're all doing and are going to do. I appreciate it.
Tamara, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share your expertise and your passion and vision with us. It's really, really heartening. So thank you all. I will follow up with you because I saw in the chat a lot of interest in these great slides. So I will ask if you're comfortable in sharing those with the group. I can grab them and share them with the group alongside the recording in case there's anything that was missed from this incredibly rich conversation. Awesome. Great. Well, way to turn it around. Our last speaker didn't show up, and now we have one that's got so much information. So way to turn around my feelings. Awesome. Great. Well, thank you to everybody for joining us today. Again, I will be in touch shortly with all of that information. Have a great, safe, healthy, restorative weekend, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you all.
Cheers.
Jessalyn, I'll get you these slides. I know we're still recording, but I will send you these slides and